Thanks so much, everybody, for coming today. This is our third New York-based symposium in the last, 6, 8 months or so, and we tend to record the panel session portions for the Workflow Show podcast that Chesapeake Systems does, so bear with us while we get that manned. All right, I'm Nick Gold. I'm the Director of Business Development at Chesapeake Systems. I know a good chunk of the people in this room and really appreciate you all coming out today. As I was saying, this is the third in our New York-based symposium series on various aspects of digital media technology and workflow. And we wanted to do something a little differently today, and we are going to be focusing on a couple of the MAM products, but this panel discussion is really to talk about the process of implementing MAM, both within your organization, kind of almost even from a cultural perspective and a change management perspective, the perspective of what you should know going into a MAM project, and then talk also about the deeper level integration possibilities with media asset management as a technology, because there's a lot of possibilities with this. It's probably the most complex technology platform and category that we work with as an integrator. It's often the most challenging for clients and vendors and integrators to fully wrap our heads around. And so we thought this would be a great way of getting into some of the deeper subjects here. I'll do quick intros for everybody. And first of all, let me thank both the Ace Hotel, our partner Nexan, the storage vendor that Chesapeake Systems does a ton of work with and loves and finds to be wonderful and reliable. They've been a big sponsor for this event today. And thank you very much to our partners, and I will introduce them all now. Greg Schiff, I've known for probably 5, 6 years at least. I've known through several incarnations at several of the storage vendors, including Active Storage and Quantum, that Chesapeake has worked with over the years. And Greg, I learned when he came on board with Levels Beyond as kind of their East Coast guy. I was like, this is awesome. This is a great spot for you. We've been working with him extensively, again, for many years now in several capacities. And now he is the East Coast rep for Reach Engine. Mike Zemlinski, I've known even for probably a few years longer. Mike has a storied history with, we first met when he was part of a rep firm called HD Sales, then was at Mac Professionals a while, another Mac-oriented systems integrator. And they did some distribution stuff. And then Mike has come on board both with Cantamo and a few of the other vendors that we work with as their U.S. rep and distributor. So Mike is basically the American face of Cantamo as well as Archiware at this point. For those of you who use any of the Archiware software, that's all coming from Mike and ProVideoTech. John Fico of Access Point is a developer that we came to know about a year and a half ago, probably for the first time. Access Point had done a number of projects with Levels Beyond, but they are a across-the-board, software, contract software development and integrator firm. And John is the lead developer there, who has been in the trenches as much as anyone I know, doing deeper level MAM integrations between media asset management platforms and some of the third-party pieces of hardware and software and the ecosystems that these things tend to connect to. And so we wanted to have him on the panel today as a voice of, the guy who actually has to do the coding to make all of these things talk with one another, because that's an important part of all of this. I thought we would start by, taking it from the get-go. Again, some of the people in this room have already started going down the path of either implementing or at least exploring media asset management, but I'd like to get each of your take on what are the right things for an organization to have in hand when they go down this road of media asset management, workflow automation, tying systems together? What is that checklist of things an organization should know about itself and have ready for the vendors they're talking to, the integrators they're talking to, that can kind of be key things that even their individual organizations can put their heads together around and have to kind of frame the entire project. Greg, what are your thoughts about that?
The first thing is they have to be ready to embark on what's going to be a big change in the overall workflow of the organization, right? This isn't going to be, coming from a storage background that I had previously, it was everybody touched the storage, but they didn't care. It was just the icon on the desktop that was there and worked in the background. And if the technology behind that changed, it didn't really affect them. Whereas this impacts everybody who's touching the systems, and often impacts the users more than the technology folks, who are often the people that I'm having a conversation with, right? And so you've got to get buy-in from everyone that things are going to change, and you have to be prepared to do that. Because if you don't have that buy-in, then it'll never happen.
So it should even be the first thing on the list is the mindset.
Yeah.
You need to be able to go through that change. Mike, maybe you can answer a little more specifically in terms of some of the, even types of documentation and accounting of systems that a client ought to probably have maybe in hand as a file that they can give someone and explains what they have going on even.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I see is a lot of the people that come to us and talk about media asset management actually may not be aware of all of the different people touching all of the various systems in their existing facility. So you come in to solve one specific problem, but you don't follow the river flows from that waterfall out to actually see where all these endpoints are. And that can either create issues down the road because you've implemented something in a maybe nonlinear way that breaks something 2 stages outside, or you're just missing out on some of the value that you can have in the system because you're really just not looking far enough out. So I think a really important thing to have is, a rough idea of what your infrastructure looks like before you even start to talk about it. Because without that in place, it's going to get uncovered, but it's going to be a much more time-consuming endeavor, and it's going to cost more. It's going to take longer. I like drawing pictures on walls, and things like that, and actually connecting the dots and figuring out how many people are in each place and what they're doing, and not be technological about it. I think really it's important to be very high level about that expectation and speak to it not in the term of products or what's actually being used, but more along the human work that's being done in each of these locations. And that can really aid in the speed of understanding and then make the implementation a lot cleaner.
John, from your perspective, some of the people in this room have smaller infrastructures. Some of the people in this room are managing some of the larger media infrastructures on the planet. For everyone, though, you have a combination of legacy systems. You may have these ideas about, well, I think I should be able to hook a MAM into these other things. When looking at it from that deeper integration perspective, bearing in mind that there's going to maybe have to be some, specific, development or customization or scripting, what about a customer's environment should they have in hand specifically with the idea of we want to tie these systems in? What are the right pieces of documentation that someone might bring to the table when they begin engaging with an integrator or with a vendor?
Well, I'd like some documentation just from a developer point of view about how they're using these systems today. How do they bring data into these systems? Are they going to continue to bring data into those systems? And then what are the outputs? How do these things get used? I think one of the big challenges of bringing in a legacy system is, where does that cutoff happen? Or is the plan to knife switch, okay, we're just going to take a weekend and bring everything from the legacy system into the new environment? People say they want to do that, but I've never seen that actually work. There's always some bleed over. There's always some project that's got to be finished Monday morning that they can't, cut that off on the weekend. So we need the ability to say, well, let's think about a plan and even develop a plan together about how we're going to use these systems in parallel until you're from one side onto the other. Or maybe you don't bring anything new into the old system, but we give you the ability to index the assets from the new system.
That's right. Having these systems in place often really can dramatically change how someone might do their job in a various way. And that the idea that there's an expectation where you're just gonna, I like thinking of it as the Frankenstein lever. It's alive, right? It's a more nuanced process than that. Greg, having been around a lot of these projects, is there something or a few things that you see that customers maybe are more often to get wrong when they go into these projects? Maybe it's assumptions that they've made that they probably shouldn't have made those assumptions about how these projects go, or the technologies or the capabilities. What are some of those things that you see again and again is like, oh, we just, what can we advertise as like, don't do this way, and you'll have a better experience for it.
I think the two things that I see are kind of to touch on what John and Mike said is that knowing what everybody's doing with the content that you're making, right? A lot of times there's a big disconnect there, and it's really frustrating when you're going down the line with a system. We're building a statement of work. We've got kind of an idea of how it's all going to happen, and they're like, "Oh yeah, by the way, we want to do this thing that totally changes, that has implications across the entire document, right? Oh well, actually, we want to archive on ingest because we need to have an LTO copy here, and oh wait a minute, and sort of changes a lot of different things. So I think it's having that, and also." I talked to customers like, oh, this is a great system. We want to do it. We're going to implement it. And then, okay, what do you want to do with it? Well, then they look for the vendor to tell them what to do with it, which always has me kind of scratching my head. Like, well, what are you doing now? And they're like, well, we want to implement best practices. And what do you guys recommend for that? And yes, we do have a lot of opinions about that. And there's things that we see over and over again. But it needs to be informed on the customer side. And you've got to really have ideas about that.
It is a little bit of an interesting strain in the dynamic between, say, a vendor or an integrator and the client, because from our point of view, I've seen this where you're not quite sure if maybe the best thing to do is just say, just do it this way. Just do it this way. It'll be better. Trust us. But you still need to kind of have that dialogue to make sure that even from the integrator point of view, you're not going in with the wrong assumptions. So yeah, it's. I think it is important for people to have a sense of what they want to do. Mike, without any, direct implications or naming any names, can you think of, a MAM or workflow automation project that just had like something go wrong because of either an assumption that was made or an approach that really someone, again, assumed that was the right way of going about things, and it led to some issues? And what were the ramifications of that?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing I see is this assumption that a MAM system just layers over on top of your existing workflows. Generally speaking, a modern MAM system actually replaces and automates a lot of your existing workflows. So I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with people that say, well, I've got my folder structure this way, so it's going to stay that way. Okay, now you have multiple metrics to search for things. So where do you put the file that is for project 1, 2, 3, 4, but also has cloudy skies? Which folder does that go into? Stunned silence. I don't know. Are you going to duplicate it? Are you going to make 2 copies of it so you can walk through the file system and find that? The idea is that don't come to the table with the expectation that this thing is just like an indexer. If you just want an indexer, there are plenty of relatively inexpensive ways to accomplish that. It's going to fundamentally change the way you find the media, bring the media in, catalog, index the media. And what I like to say is forget about the file system, because some of you guys that are in the bigger shops know that a file system itself is not a prerequisite for storage anymore. When you start to get into some of these larger storage systems like object storage, lattice, and object matrix, and so on and so forth, there is no file system. So the concept of a file system is really completely irrelevant other than for the entry and exit points from the system. That's a huge one that I see pretty regularly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that people were, sort of in a legacy way, were encoding metadata into our file system, right? That's what it is. That's that whole hierarchical folder structure is metadata, right? And we hold on to that, and getting people to say, wait, no, it doesn't matter. Now we're actually going to do it the right way.
John, think about a MAM project that you've had to do some development work on. Is there a hiccup with an integration you had to do that, again, without being too specific, you can just use as a frame of reference for, again, maybe an assumption that someone got wrong about how easy something would be to implement or the time it would take?
I think the biggest hiccups typically occur, I mean, there's more than one side to implementing a MAM. You've got your IT group that has a certain set of expectations. The creatives have a certain set of expectations. The librarians have a certain set of expectations. And where it's gone wrong is where we've only gotten one of or two of those side inputs before we start to develop. So you have, you design 2 sides of this triangle, and then the IT group says, well, no, we don't have enough disk to keep everything online all the time. Well, that's what the creative guys said they wanted, so there's a disconnect there. And then you have to start working around because you're, 6-8 months into this project, and you're finding it out then. that becomes the issue, where you could manage this a little better if you had the sort of like what we were saying before, if you had input from all three sides already and you could plan it out and this is how we're going to solve the problem, then I think that can alleviate a lot of the hiccups.
And that's important. And, again, we deal with many different types of organizations. All of us do. And there are some where, IT and the support of the creatives are very, integrated. There's ones where the creatives and the people who have to support the creatives are very isolated from IT. I think it helps to be realistic and know which type you are, right? And again, we talked about getting buy-in from the different stakeholders. Well, at a certain point, IT is probably going to be involved unless you're on a completely isolated system. So you need to know in advance and be able to frankly convey, I think, to the vendors that you're working with, well, here's things we may run into. We don't have necessarily a great history of working with those guys, or maybe it's these guys are great. We work with them all the time. We want them to be involved from the get-go. And they'll be very frank with you about kind of their perspective from kind of the IT world, and it's meshed, but know what you are. One of the things, speaking about kind of assumptions and where I think, hiccups can occur is, again, as I said earlier, media asset management is by far and away the most complicated set of media technologies that we deal with. And it's such a broad phrase, too, because, I should probably define it, because that's another thing that confuses people. I think there's so many different phrases and pieces of terminology. Is something a MAM, a DAM, a PAM, integrating these things, knowing the vocabulary, frankly, or at least making sure you're speaking the same vocabulary and have the same set of definitions for things as the vendors you're working with, or that different people on your internal teams have kind of the same nomenclature at their disposal, really, really critical. But another thing is the phases of a project, because this is such a complicated set of technologies. The possibilities are, I don't want to say endless, but you keep coming up with new use cases. When going into a project or even standing up a new use case for media asset management, Greg, what would you say would be a good breakdown and way of framing out the phases of a project that are a combination of, getting people what they want when they want it, but also kind of just being realistic about how these things tend to get adopted in an organization?
Right. So when we do deployments with Reach Engine, it is almost always a three-phase kind of scenario, right? The first phase is that discovery phase, and that is so important. It's what we've been talking about before, getting the stakeholders in the room. Everybody sits down, we talk about what they're doing now, what the system's going to do. We map out all of the asset management, the metadata schema if they have it, and start to talk about what processes we're going to automate. And then from that discovery meeting, I'm able to craft typically two different SOWs, right? There's a phase one statement of work, and that's usually pretty out-of-the-box functionality. It's easy wins, it's stuff that's immediately going to make people's lives better and not more complicated, and is integrations that we've seen before typically. And then the second phase is, hey, people have used it for a while, their thinking inevitably changes about what they want to do, and it's typically a little more specialized. Okay, there's some scheduling tool that we've never seen before that these guys are using, and we want to have the MAM talk to it so that when a new job is made in the scheduling tool, it creates a metadata framework for that within Reach Engine, and there's a landing pad for the content as it starts to come in. So that's typically how it is. It's a couple of phases. It's several months typically to implement, but you've got to break it up that way. Excuse me. When we've tried to combine all of that into one big statement of work, it just doesn't. The projects drag on, there's scope creep, people, because the thinking changes while they're using the system, all of a sudden they want it to do all these things like, whoa, we didn't talk about that 6 months ago. So having a pause in between the first and second phase really allows for that creativity on the customer side, and also when we're getting in there to kind of see what new things we can do.
Mike, can you speak a little bit more about what types of things a customer might get out of a MAM deployment in phase one? The things that are kind of those easy wins that, again, get the system in people's hands so their creativity about how they might do further development around that might go in phase 2? And then what are some of the types of things that might be a little aggressive for phase 1 and you might want to think about a little bit further down the path?
Well, I mean, I think I generally feel like if you have much more than 1 or 2 little custom workflows in phase 1, you're biting off more than you can chew. In general, MAM systems are unique in this, and we've said this 3 times, I think, already today, that users and technicians are working in harmony with the MAM system. There is a lot of automation happening in the back end, and there's a lot of UI integration happening on the front end. There are people that are creative that have to use the thing day in and day out. So making sure that that harmony is maintained means not trying to bite off more than you can chew and trying to replace too much of somebody's job with a new tool. I mean, if a new who here has ever just switched overnight to a new editing platform? Anyone? And just said, you know what, Final Cut 7's gone. Tomorrow we're getting rid of it and we're switching over to something new. It doesn't happen. So don't have that expectation with something that is arguably bigger and touches more people than what your some of your core tools are. So I think really on that first phase, it's really defining an organizational schema and taxonomy, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But having that, and then kind of mapping your endpoints and your outpoints. Where do you want this thing? Where do you want stuff to come in? Who do you want stuff to go out to? And how do we organize it? And not try to get too much more in depth than that on a phase 1 approach. Because once that workflow is settled and in place, the customization becomes relatively easy because you've got full-scale buy-in and everybody understands some of the capabilities of the system already to make intelligent suggestions. I can't tell you how many phone calls I've been on where somebody makes a suggestion like, I'd really love it if, this thing could birth a new unicorn for me. And the reality is it just can't do that. And
Our product does do that.
yeah.
Now with unicorn horn. John, every vendor wants to close deals, right? Of course. We all want to sell more MAM systems. And sometimes I find the customers, the clients, are very aggressive about trying to get the deals closed as well. They're like, no, we need to be able to execute this, thing that's going to completely transform our entire organization potentially, or maybe over time. But we got to close the deal in a week because, funding period is coming for an end. And sometimes those are the realities on the ground, right? Everyone potentially has budget windows and things like that. We've talked a little bit about how to phase out the implementation, but being a guy who actually has to make a lot of this stuff work, what might you say to the actual phase 1, which is before you've even cut a deal? What should a customer who's thinking about this, thinking about integrations that they might want to take place, do in that pre-sales phase with the vendor or vendors that they're working with that, again, sometimes gets glossed through? What are those things that would make your life as the guy writing the code easier if more time had been spent before a deal was executed?
Well, the 2 biggest things that are more difficult to change after the fact, let's say it that way. Metadata is key. So defining what metadata you want, not just what metadata, not just the schema and all the taxonomy and where you want to store it, but at what point does that metadata get associated with your assets? When we do ingestion workflows, one of the powers of that ingestion workflow is forcing the system or the user or whoever's putting the asset into the system to provide some minimum level of metadata, because you're going to have to be able to find this thing later. So that's on the inbound side. On the outbound side is, how long do you want this asset to live in its various stages? How long is it going to be on spinning disk? Where is it going to get put to tape? How many copies? Not necessarily how many copies. I don't need that phase 1. But I need to know whether I have to put metadata on this object on ingestion to say, I'm using this object right now, don't take it off tape, right? If now you're 6 months in and we're doing phase 2, and you've decided now you want this crazy archival scheme that relies on data that I should have put on that asset 6 months ago, now I've got a bigger problem. Now I've got to do some kind of update scripts or some kind of fancy stuff.
And, one of the things that I think is a little, and we're going to have questions and answers right at the end of the panel discussion, so hold them tight, make a mental note of them, and then we'll just kind of hit them rapid fire when we're done yammering on. it's funny, media asset management quotes, not necessarily the scopes of work, but the quotes themselves, I think, are often misleadingly simple, right? You might have a server or several, so there's a few hardware boxes. You might have a software license on it. You might have an annual support and maintenance fee. Sometimes that's bundled with the first year of the software purchase. Sometimes it's a separate line item. And then you've got like pro services, which, yes, is a scope. But, what you're saying about, a lot goes into that. And the estimate of the cost of that is really based on nitty-gritty specific things that you get into in pre-sales. And so, just to back up your point, that the more specific you can communicate what your goals are and what you really expect out of that lump of labor with the vendors before executing a contract or sending a purchase order is better. And one of the things I find, sometimes when you're not having to do the integrations yourself and you're working with partners, which is, of course, we all think a wonderful way to do it, but you may make an assumption about, well, okay, maybe we didn't quite specifically describe that, but we want to just do it's a little tweak. It shouldn't really affect anything. And I mean, as you know, sometimes what seems like a really little tweak can be like, oh, well, that's an extra week of work to do that extra development work because you didn't say you wanted to do it that way. And this can lead to some strained relations at times when people are like, guys, this isn't what we talked about, and you're going to need to pay us more to do that. And so, again, being as nitty-gritty before even closing the deal and thinking of the pre-sales conversation as a very legitimate phase in the process, I think is a really, really important one. Guys, what are questions that you think are the right ones for customers to be asking of their vendors? What are the things that they want to put out there? What are the things, that you want them to be asking you about as they're evaluating a platform? Again, this is pretty complicated stuff. I find that usually the customers who ask some of the best, some of the toughest, and the most nuanced questions are the ones that we have the most success with because they hit us with the nitty-gritty stuff ahead of time so there were less surprises all around. Can you, Greg, throw out some good questions that you think people should be hitting, whether it's the integrator, whether it's the software development company that makes the products? What are the ones that you kind of like, guys, shouldn't you have asked me about X, Y, and Z? Because it seems like you're making some serious assumptions if you haven't asked me about this stuff.
I think it's to hit on what we talked about before. How is data getting out of the system, right? How are we going to do the delivery? How do you do that? Where is it going? And who defines that, right? I think that's.
I mean, sometimes it's really basic too. Like we find ourselves in the position of we're implementing a system, and when we talk about ingesting in MAMs, obviously that's sometimes the ingesting of files and moving them onto a new file system, but sometimes that's just kind of making the database aware of them. And there's some really basic things that we probably deserve to get into more depth on, like how do things show up in the MAM database? What gets them there?
Yeah.
What is do I drag it into a folder? Is there a user interface? What does that user interface look like? But I mean, people often don't even really dwell on that ahead of time, and they're like, oh yeah, so that's how it gets in there?
Yeah, I think there's that, and the other one is if you have some specific file types with weird requirements, maybe not even weird, right? Oh, we have multi-track audio, we've got these embedded subtitles. Oh no, the subtitles actually live on some external file, and we need to mate these two. And so to kind of ask us, how do we actually deal with the specific files that you're working with? Because as we know, in the video space, there's a lot of diversity there about how what can read what, and how data is associated with it, and it can be, there's things that we do well and things we don't do
especially
as well.
with a lot of the non-flat file
Right.
formats that often come off of cameras and tapeless workflows. They can be difficult for a MAM to work
Right,
with.
and if I think about that, that's where when we're deep into it, and they're like, oh, we just assumed you handled those kinds of files because that's the kind of file I live with, so I assume that it's a standard thing that everyone's using, and we're like, we've never seen that before in the universe because you're the only one doing it, and ... And they're like, oh, well, that's kind of a deal breaker. They're like, it's a little late for that. So
Mike, what are questions that you think are the right ones for people to be asking, pre-sales, going into a project, identifying, if not which vendor they're going to go with, how they're going to do their implementation strategy?
Well, I think honestly, there are a few business level questions that often get just completely glanced over. What is the long-term cost of putting the solution in place? Yeah, you cut a PO, you get some stuff, gets all done, and then it's been a year. Does it cost you more next year? Does it not cost you more next year? Do you have to spend that money? Do you not have to spend that money? What's your long-term goal for the system? What's the scalability level on the system? How much does it cost to scale that system? These are the sort of things that if you don't know up front, you get what I like to call the golden handcuffs, right? You spend a lot of money up front, and now you're stuck spending money in the future, potentially, because you didn't look at it across a 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 10-year, depending on your use case. If you're looking at a MAM system to be a front end for your archive, how long is your archive data valuable for? So how long should you be looking at ROI into the future for the cost of that MAM system? If your answer is only 3 years, well, guess what? Throw them on LaCie hard drives on the shelf, because that's going to be a whole lot cheaper than putting in a full-on MAM system. But if it's I want to keep this stuff for 10 years, okay, what's the migration strategy? How's this thing handled multiple different types of storages? Because in 5 years, the storage you have right now is definitely not going to be what you want to be running it on. And is that methodology for talking to storage even going to be viable? I mean, I like to think back to 5 years ago, here had even heard of REST-capable storage and was using, object-based storage for distribution. And now it's actually fairly common, and it's becoming a usable workflow. So I think that's something that oftentimes gets missed. Everybody looks at the very granular, what's my budget right now to get this project done that I've got very specific on, and they don't think about the long term. And if you don't think about the long term, it becomes very difficult to actually plan a long-term strategy.
John, what questions from a developer perspective would you want people to be asking? What clarifications would you actually feel good about if they were seeking them from you, ahead of you supposedly making these wonderful things happen? Maybe even get somewhat specific about development work you've had to do that maybe someone is, again, didn't ask quite the right question.
Well, it's kind of funny. It's when I was getting married, somebody told me that everybody, bridegroom would always have one thing that they care more about than anything else. And I sort of want to know when I'm in the beginnings of an implementation, what's your one or two things that you care about more than anything else? Because I've had cases where I want to pull metadata from a third-party system. Well, all right, that's gonna take some figuring out potentially, depending on what that system is, real-time updates and things of that nature. If it's I want to maximize uptime, if it's I want to maximize my storage efficiency so that I could save money on disk. What are the things that are really, really important to the way that you do business? Because then I can try to figure out whether we're good at that or not good at that. Because in some cases, the answer is you're not going to be able to get there with what I've got, or you may be able to get there in 6 months.
You spoke to the figuring out, and this is an interesting dynamic of these types of projects. You may be XYZ customer, and you use ABC vendor's archive solution, which of course has its own software layer, its own database, uses its own formats, may or may not have its own APIs for communicating with third-party software. And I think there's this, again, an interesting dynamic here between that. Let's say it's something you've never done an integration for, Frank's archive system. You're going to have to do figuring out to figure out how we are going to hook into it. How do we get things from the MAM into it? Is there any interesting data we can then extract out of it to bring back into the MAM, like a tape barcode number or label name or something like that? How do we initiate the restore? I'm curious, just that act of figuring out how to make it happen is consulting. That's work. And I think there's this interesting dynamic too where we often have to kind of make guesses pre-sales about how long it might take just to do that figuring out phase. And we don't want to just give away all of that because that's real legitimate consulting. We're figuring out, we're getting documentation, we're pouring through it, we're learning some new APIs. Have you found that there's a resistance to paying for even some of that discovery phase so you can be even more effective and more efficient when it's time to actually roll it out and do the integrations?
I don't know if I've seen a resistance to the business front end of it because I usually come in after that. But my gut is that we try to build that into the original SOW, which is why I need to know if you are using Frank's tape drive system or you're using something I've already implemented with. The other challenge is, how do I test this? I don't have a Frank's tape drive system on my 6th Avenue office, right? How do I play with this? Do I get a development area on your tape drive, and am I doing essentially development in your shop to make that all work? And sometimes the answer to that is yes. And sometimes it's, well, we've done this before, so we know these plugins work. Just configure them and they go.
Greg, maybe you can kind of speak to that as well. I mean, sometimes things you have to kind of play with and massage to get them fully baked to work. It is often a little bit of a discovery process for us on our side as well to just make sure we're figuring out how to get it to work. I think generally execute these things very well. I wouldn't be in a room with you guys right now doing this if I didn't think you guys stood behind what you said you were going to do. But what can you say to just, again, setting the proper set of expectations on the client side as to like what level of finagling and tweaking kind of once the system is even kind of rolled out should be expected? Because again, it can be hard to really frame out the whole thing in a lab.
Yeah, I think to speak to a little bit what you said before, we definitely see pushback for customers wanting to pay for that discovery process. They'll be like, oh, well, then just do the whole thing as a proof of concept, and then after the proof of concept, we'll decide whether or not we want to buy it. And or they'll say, well, you should be doing that anyway, so do it, not realizing that their system is. Everybody's system is unique, and there are some things that you see over and over again. Okay, yeah, we're talking to a store Nexan on Nexan disk, and okay, but that's pretty straight ahead. But all the other things, there's a lot of this. You have to have appetite for that. If you want to get the most ROI out of your MAM system, you have to be willing to have a partner, have a developer that's going to work with you to build your snowflake, right? Because a lot of times it is a snowflake. And so there has to be appetite for it, and there really should be budget for it. And if you're not willing to put the budget behind it or have the appetite to work with something that might not work at first, we're gonna have to test it and massage it. You're gonna limit yourself, right? Because then you're gonna just get a product that does the few things that everybody does and doesn't necessarily meet your specific business logic for what you want to do.
Mike, what do you think about the idea of pilot programs? Even if you've committed to make a purchase, but just the idea that once this tech is stood up, we might deliberately hold it back from everyone. We might have a few kind of test users. Maybe there's some of the more advanced users. Do you think that's an appropriate way of going about this? Do you think that leads to better outcomes?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when I talk to like workflows and functionality that the product can do out of the gate, I have two kind of statements. Yep, we can do that, or theoretically we can do that. And the second one comes with the caveat. That costs money, right? Because somebody is going to have to figure it out. Yes, we have an API. Yes, they have an API. Yes, in theory, they will talk very cleanly because we understand the fundamentals of both of them. Have we ever actually done it? No, we haven't. You're going to be the first one. And if you're okay with that, then, there's no issue there. But if you're not okay with that, it's a very interesting dynamic at that point because, if you're going to sit around and wait for somebody else to be the first one to do it, you may never actually get it because, like Greg said, he used the snowflake term. I use that all the time. Not a single person in this room is going to have the same schema or design or storage infrastructure or backend. MAM systems layer on top of your business units. They don't layer on top of your software applications. So while, yes, you may be using Avid and you may be using a MAM, the way you use it and the way you pipe it from one site to the next site and the people that use it is completely different from anybody else. So the expectation that, a truly vetted MAM system can do everything out of the box it's a kind of a false reality, And from a sales perspective, our marketing slides are meant to say yes, we can do everything because in theory, we can do everything. But there are realities to a lot of those situations. And if the functionality is there and you're willing to take the time to dive into it with us, then we'll go down that path. But it's definitely with that differential in place, it's very difficult to even say up front how much time something might take in certain cases.
Yeah.
Is there any key vocabulary that you wish every client and every vendor were completely on the same page with? Are there ways, we're geeks for this. Three of us went out the other night and we probably spent half the night talking about media asset management systems because that's how we roll. And but that can lead to maybe sometimes taking for granted some of the complexity in these things. We even use the word metadata. We talk about schemas. To us that means something pretty specific, right? Sometimes we even talk about like the ontological approach of organizing your information, and like suddenly we're just frankly not having, I think, a frankly good conversation with the customer. There's ways of getting them on the page. I mean, are there terms, phrases, way of thinking about things, but just the meaning of the actual words we use when we're describing these systems that would be good for people to be on the same page of?
I think the number one is taxonomy, right? That when you really get into MAM systems, taxonomy is key. Your metadata now becomes your ability to search for things, and your metadata is your business. It's not ours. So when again, I can't tell you how many times somebody's been like, so what fields should I use? I don't know. I'm pretty sure UNICEF and MTV have different fields to look up things within their systems and have different metrics for what is important and searchable. So I can't even begin to tell you how to define that. I can share with you ways people have implemented certain field types and the way that they have used the system, but the actual overarching taxonomy, which is the terms, the schema that you're using, when that's available, who it's available to, it's up a level. It's above the technology itself. It's really more at the business unit level and trying to understand how you locate things, find things, and above and beyond that, there's really two different types of metadata. You have what I would consider physical metadata, things that describe content, and then there is functional metadata, things that trigger automations and moves and triggers and various different things, and they're two very different things. So, that schema is interspersed in most cases. So I think that's like the single most important thing when you're going into a MAM discussion. If you haven't had an internal discussion already about what your taxonomy is going to look like, when that guy shows up and he's like, yep, system's installed, let's start building the schema, and you guys just, the jaw drops and you don't know what's going on, it's wasted dollars at that point.
Greg, a lot of organizations, they may have some organizational systems that they've developed over time. They may even have keywords that they've used, deliberately in their project file formats when doing subclipping or, naming conventions of folders and things like that, which, as you said earlier, are kind of that first level metadata that people have already been working with. But in your experience, how does an organization do the type of organizational level thinking that Mike was describing, both in the words we use? I call it qualitative metadata. I actually think of three. There's like the intrinsic metadata. These are the formats of the files, the frame rate, the frame size, all of that stuff. There's the qualitative metadata that a human typically has to tag, in order to basically power search and organization. And then I call it process-oriented metadata that drives workflows, sets variables. If a workflow is doing its thing, it's drawing metadata values to tweak how that workflow is actually working. This format is going to this delivery type. These people need a notification, all of that stuff. But I mean, Greg, how does an organization really go through that process? Who are the stakeholders who need to be involved with that? Who are the people in the organization who should be even part of the pre-sales discussions in order to make sure that it's not just a jaw drop when you're like, okay, what tags do you want, guys?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that it's hard, right? It's a real challenge. I think that's probably the biggest challenge of something like this is figuring that out, especially if it hasn't, you've never done it before, you've kind of done it in a ad hoc kind of piecemeal way, right? And it's great if you have an organization that has a librarian or an archivist or someone who does that kind of thing for a living that can guide the process. But pending that, I think it's you got to have meetings that aren't meetings with your vendor, right? It's internal discussions within the organization, and they can be informed somewhat. These are sort of parallel processes where we're talking about what's that phase one statement of work for the MAM, and then that can help inform some of these other discussions about what some of these other metadata fields should be, right? These discussions can inform each other, but they need to be had separately and then brought together kind of at the end. And I think that's where there are certainly consultants out there that can help with that kind of thing, and there's some value there, and then there's just value in bringing the people who are using the data on a day-to-day basis together to talk about what information they need.
Especially the qualitative section. I mean, I'm going to drive the process control metadata. I'm either going to use metadata because sometimes they're double, right? Sometimes the do not archive flag is both a qualitative statement and it drives whether or not I archive the workflow. But most of the workflow-driven metadata is stuff that I'm going to add after the fact. The intrinsic metadata is stuff that's in the file format. We collect that as a matter of course. But that qualitative, how do you do business? How are you going to want to get this stuff back later? What are you going to want to search on? If you don't put it in on ingestion or soon after ingestion, it's never going to get put on that asset.
And it's
you're never
tough
gonna find that stuff.
because, an organization may be like, well, we think these 4 fields will do it for us. And you're like, you probably want a few more than that, because if you start coming up with a bunch of new fields 6 months from now, you're going to have a whole bunch of content you put in there that need to be retagged now. Wouldn't it be good to have something a little more fully functional right out of the gate?
Well, and even worse than that, it's
Too
not
much.
even just re-tagging. It's the fact that you're functionally orphaning media now. If you add metadata after the fact, and it's not like it's the end of the world, but if you add very formal and specific and needed business unit metadata after you've been using the system for a while, you have functionally just deleted all the files before, because the first person that searches for only that field is going to return none of the assets before its creation. And there really is no logical way for qualitative metadata to go back and script it. Somebody's got to go back and audit all of your existing stuff because it's qualitative.
And nobody does
Absolutely.
And no one ever does. So, and I almost think of that schema and that qualitative metadata is as important as when on the scope of work it says, the server has to be in the rack and I need 2 Ethernet cables. We also need your qualitative metadata schema. And there's a certain degree of, each product handles the way those schemas work independently and what you can actually accomplish and what tools you have to do that. But you don't need to get into that until you already have a first pass discussion. And that's something that none of us up here even need to be involved in. It's something that has to do with your business and the way you want to collect, find, search, and distribute your assets.
Yeah, and there's also a risk in the other extreme of too much metadata. Like
Right.
a user, unless they are paid to be the tagger, the logger, the librarian, they are the person who is in the MAM all day long tagging things, and that's their job. They helped come up with the taxonomy, and you're paying them to do that. I hate to say it, but at this point, I haven't seen too many editors that you can pay to put 50 tags on a clip, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have like the Goldilocks. It's just right. It's in the middle. It's going to be useful enough to power searches, power workflows, but not be so granular that no one's going to use the system. I like to think that if you're coming up with a metadata schema that if you put just the right set of variables, you feel like you're always going to find the one clip you're looking for, you might be a little too granular.
If you get it down to 10, think of it like that first page of a Google search. If it's on that first page, you've done your job. You could find your asset.
Yeah, you don't need to eliminate 99% of someone's time in a day doing searches. If you can eliminate 90% and have a system that people are actually much happier using, you've still just saved yourself a lot of time. I'm going to, I think at this point, open up things for some questions in the audience. So I saw some hands earlier. And if you could give your name and organization or affiliation as well, that would be fantastic.
I'm David Geschwind of Three Dimensional Media Group. without naming names, unless you want to, could you identify half a dozen customers in terms of what kind of business they're in? What are the assets they're managing? What is the atom? In other words, are we talking about half-hour sitcom episodes for syndication? Are we talking about individual frames at an animation house? And order of magnitude, how many items do you have in a library before it's worth investing in a management system?
Very good question.
The answer is yes.
We've seen it all.
Yeah, literally. I mean, from a vertical market perspective, everything under the sun. I mean, just look around the room at everybody's name tags. You know, yes, there's some traditional media in the room, but a lot of the people here are not from a traditional media, and from those non-traditional media environments, how many of you are in the same business vertical? It's very, very common to be, you know, across quite a few different, you know, the thing about asset management is it really is, as media becomes more and more important to your organization, it does become a replacement for something that you have been using for years, and that is the file system on your file server or your SAN. It becomes the tool that allows you to track all this stuff, which this same problem happened with still images and Excel files and everything like that 15 years ago, but media was not as ubiquitous as it is now. Now we've got phones in our pockets, and everybody here could be shooting an hour and a half of video right now, have that checked into a system. And now that that's happening, you know, being able to recover that content and find it, a file system's just a little antiquated for that. Can you do it? Yeah. Is it efficient? Not generally.
Greg, can you speak to the numbers of assets and the spectrum that you've seen? Because again, there's a lot of diversity there as well. We have some small organizations that are seeking to do MAM, and we've got some very large ones with millions and millions and millions of assets. I mean,
Yeah, I have customers where we have 20 terabytes on an old XAN somewhere that we want to catalog, and or even it's an archive only. We're not even using it for production. So we've got some stuff that's been archived using tool XYZ. We want you to bring that archive in and just be able to search it and make use of that stuff, on up to customers with millions of assets and 15 petabyte libraries. You know, some of our big customers go that high. So it's all over the place, and it's finding, you know, I think it's when, you know, as an organization, with kind of what Mike said, the idea of a file-based workflow where you have this file system, and that's what you use to find things. And as long as that's working, it works. But then you get pretty quickly to a point, especially if there's multiple people touching that file system, where that stops working. And you have to kind of go away from, and Nick's heard this before, from the file-based workflow to a content-based workflow, where I don't care where the file lives or what it's named or any of that stuff. I shouldn't have to think about that. I care about what it is and what I want to do with it. And then the storage and all that stuff, just who cares about that? And it's a much more human way to work. And I think it's really, you know, as an organization, when things start to fall off, and it happens, it can happen pretty quickly.
And I think it's multiplicative, and I think you hit on the two sort of axes. It's number of assets and the number of people, right? If you've got a lot of assets, even if you're doing it on your own, trying to find stuff, you know, I can't even find, you know, baby pictures at this point because there's thousands of them. Or if you have a whole team of people, even if your number of assets are small, that complexity can get to the point where you don't know who's using what, who's got what locked. You don't know some of the check-in, check-out kind of workflows. That becomes important too. So those two factors can sort of drive you to a MAM as opposed to files on a hard drive.
Yeah, we just recently did one that's 3 users, but it's a petabyte and a half of storage behind it. You know, it's the librarian's front end for their entire corporate archive. And then we've also got ones where there's 30 people using it, and maybe it's only 30 terabytes of storage. You know, so asset count, and they don't necessarily have to be inversely proportional, but the reality is that it starts to become valuable when you have a lot of people or when you have a lot of assets. And if you have both, it becomes doubly
Very
valuable.
important, yeah.
okay, who else over here?
Hi, I'm Kara Van Malsen from AV Preserve. We are a consulting firm, and basically we do everything that you guys just described people need to do. So, I mean, I would be remiss not to say like that there are consultants who do this kind of work, help you with the discovery, articulate your business needs, your requirements, your use cases, your taxonomy, your metadata schema, get the buy-in of all the stakeholders. That's basically what we do. And we use that to help clients identify solutions that will work for their needs. And so one of the questions, I have many questions, but I'll just limit it to one. Question that I have is that when you find potential clients, maybe you haven't even definitely gone ahead with them, but do you have alarm bells go off when people come to you and they're like, we need a MAM? Yep. Can you give us one? And okay, sure. I mean, they haven't gone through any of the things that you've gone through. Somebody at their company plays golf with somebody else who uses your product, and they say, great, we want that. Yes, thank you very much. Because to us, one of the answers to the questions that the questions that you might be raising is, maybe you're not the right solution. And do you ever come to that conclusion, or how do you deal with that situation when you kind of realize perhaps there's more work to be done before we work with you? I mean, do you ever encounter that, and how do you deal with that?
So I'm going to take the first stab at that. So the Chesapeake Systems answer to this question is, this is why we work with multiple platform partners. And that's actually, I mean, a very big part of our philosophy. Number one, because we've gotten burned in the past when a company, Apple, changes, on a dime their strategy and discontinues their entire server and RAID division, or dramatically changes their editing platform, right? Or a company just sometimes goes out of business, even unexpectedly. Some of us used storage or worked for the storage companies that may have happened to. So, we have chosen that we want to have multiple partners, and I always talk about there's a lot of different spectrums that MAMs reside on. There's is it kind of outwardly focused for a larger set of users who are doing fairly basic search type stuff, and it's really to identify assets and maybe trigger some basic workflows? Or is it a really post-production heavy work group? And few of the platforms can do both of those things very effectively, although some of them can. But this is why we kind of have multiple partners, and we kind of have a sense about which one of the partners that we work with may seem more appropriate, but we'll often present multiple solutions and go pretty deeply down that path. What you said about, you guys and the guys at Audiovisual Preservation Solutions are another partner of ours, and we have a lot of respect for them. They've been participants in some of our previous symposiums. And, it's tough because I wish every client kind of valued that process of learning about themselves enough to inherently think to work with your type of consulting company as well as us who kind of do the technical implementation. And it's a little challenging because first of all, I don't think necessarily lots of people know people like you guys exist. So everyone in this room, they exist, but and they're great. But it's also kind of a very brainy process, right? And I think some people just are like, they're so used to being in the trenches of media production. This idea of kind of taking a step back, and, getting meta on what they do is just not the type of work they always are used to doing. They're used to doing their job. They have deadlines. They're publishing content on the web. And so it's a tough dynamic. The other dynamic is you may be a small organization with a lot of legacy media content, and you need that deeper discovery phase to develop your metadata taxonomy, to come up with some of the workflows, to even figure out, like, how long is it going to take me to digitize this legacy videotape collection, all of the stuff that you guys do consulting on. And yet they might not have the resources to bring in yet another consulting firm. And so, it's a tough dynamic, but it's a very important one, and one that we have certainly brought some people, towards the folks who do that level of consulting.
I just want to rephrase a little bit, maybe, because you're absolutely right, and I know most people, maybe it's not most, but I know a large percentage of potential users of MAMs, organizations, do not go through this process. We don't see those. We only see the ones that we work with, right? And so do you. So what I'm curious about is, how do the product vendors deal with this situation? Because I agree with and I know that you guys do great work of working with various partners and helping kind of mitigate this process or the risks. But what if you're confronted with it as the vendor? And this is a tough question, I think. How do you kind of help them help themselves?
Well, I think when I sit down with an organization for the first time, we've seen it enough that you can kind of quickly vet whether or not their expectations are realistic or not, or whether or not we're going to be a good fit, or if it's a square hole round peg kind of situation, right? So I think that's just a part of being a, shall we say, pre-sales engineer or someone who's been doing this kind of thing for a while. You need to be able to kind of quickly get through the process, and then you can vet in your mind, okay, well, we're gonna, it's a fit? Oh, great. Okay, now is this an organization that needs, do they have the resources to hire a consultant to talk about this stuff? Or is it gonna be enough for me to bring in a partner like a Chesapeake Systems that can help them with it? And, we also work with a variety of partners, and I have certain partners that I know do some things really well and others that do other things well. So it's then choosing what partner to partner them with. And then that kind of informs how long this whole thing is going to be. Is this going to be a film festival photo archive project that we're going to be able to nail out in 6 weeks, or is this going to be a major sports organization that's going to take a year to implement? So I think it's just working with the customer. It becomes clear.
Mike, what do you say?
I mean, the reality is with what the products do, if you have enough time and money, the answer is always gonna be yes. So having a realistic budget in place is going to really quickly define whether or not it's a viable solution or not.
But that may mean like rewriting the software. But again, the MAM vendors are mostly came out of consulting groups that write a lot of software. And
Yeah,
so
I mean,
their proclivity is to lean towards, sure, we can do it. We can
yeah,
code it up.
the reality is that there are things that are just full-on stoppers that when you hear them, you're like, could we do it? Probably. Do you want to? No, we don't want to. It would eat up all of our time to do that. And even if you cut me a check for $1 million, I'd lose all my other customers because we'd be too busy trying to, birth another unicorn. Yes, that's the second unicorn birth statement I've made today.
We like unicorns.
Yeah, and these guys are like Pegasus and unicorn manufacturers, so that's why, I think to a certain extent, when we talked earlier about the phased approach of, rolling out something and understanding the fundamental core where you want to go with it and what it's capable, what its core functionalities are, if it fits within the phase one desires fit within the core functionalities, then it's a go. And the other pie in the sky stuff very well may be capable in a phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, whatever the case may be. And then you team up with somebody that does custom development. Almost every single one of the MAM projects I've done in recent years has had some degree of customization to meet a very specific need within a very specific business unit. So if I said no to everything, nobody would ever buy the software. It's yes with an asterisk. Do you have the budget? Do you have the time? And do you have the proclivity to take that budget and time and use it? Because sometimes you have the budget and the time, but you don't want to spend it on that thing. You want to spend it on something else. So, I'm pretty clear about when we really can't do something. But the rest of the time, it's a question of how much time are you willing to spend, and the answer may be that their stuff can do that little thing a lot better than we can, and then now you have a direction to go to. But there's a lot of crossover.
The other thing I'll say, Kara, is I think there's been, we've been dealing with media asset management for probably 8-9 years now, and I think there's been some maturization process that's taken place amongst the vendors. When we first started working with some of the MAM vendors that were catering towards really media users specifically, I think they leaned much more to, sure, yeah, we can definitely do it. Oh, it does it. Here's how you would have to do it using it. But, they kind of leaned towards yes a little too much. And I think there's enough vendors out there that have different areas of strength, and the vendors themselves know what their strengths are because they simply have more projects under their belts now. They don't want to get themselves into a terrible situation. They don't want that track record. They don't, word of that gets around, oh, we did an implementation of such and such MAM and it stunk. We have to replace it now. They don't want that getting out there. They want their projects to be a success and to go smoothly, and they don't want it to completely tax their resources because, these guys can stamp out a software license like this, but they can't necessarily, make every customization that you want to have happen in order for their system to work for you to happen quite so easily. It takes a lot of effort. And so I've seen them getting better about stepping away from projects that just don't pass their own kind of smell test. And I like to think that myself and the partners that we work with tend to be pretty clear cut about that. And we, again, it's not like a whispered asterisk. We tend to just put those things really out there so people can understand, what they might be getting into. But it's very, very worthwhile to be aware of those types of things. More questions? Anyone? We've got time for a couple more. Justin?
In doing one of these deployments, there's kind of the functional side of it, the workflow orchestration, how files move around, how things actually happen in the system. And there's also then the front end. And if we want to deploy a system that has potentially hundreds of users, designers, PAs, editors, even people who are not, people who are not directly in the departments that create the content that's on the system, is it better to start with that core functionality and get that up and running and then develop a front end for that? Or is it better to start with the front end in mind, sort of to rough out that framework, because the front end is kind of what makes it usable and what can get the broad acceptance, so we don't just deploy a tool that when it gets deployed it looks crummy or doesn't have all the right buttons and
isn't equal to or better than what people currently have.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. I think to a certain extent it's an unrealistic expectation for your primary goal to be a customization. It's just, not to say that it's not doable, but the cost in either human time or consulting dollars or both, whatever, depending on your organization's capabilities, to build something that is very specific to you as being a core functionality is something that, you're not going to find that very easily. I think really what you want to be looking at is look at your own internal resources as far as if you want to customize and develop that front end to meet needs. If you don't have the internal resources, start to look outside and then look at the tool sets that are made available by the different vendors and pick the one that you feel like has the easiest fit for what your use case is. Because some MAM vendors, wide open. We can do anything under the sun when it comes to the front end development. Others are very, very rigid, depending on, or their framework isn't very well vetted. So you're starting from scratch really when it comes to devising a front end versus just kind of tweaking and turning knobs. And there's a kind of everywhere in between depending on who you go with. So I don't know, Greg, if you got anything to add on top of that?
No, I agree with what you said. I think that, from our standpoint, we have the GUI when you log in, and it looks a particular way, and a lot of thought went into that, and we don't allow you to kind of tweak that. And that seems to annoy some customers, and other customers really like it. And we provide an API so that if you want to build something else on top of it that talks to the product underneath, it's possible to do. And I think that most MAM vendors, will allow something like that. So then it comes back to, I think if you have a front end in mind, having that sketched out and in the back of your mind, or maybe something you talk about up front, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's a phase 2 or maybe a phase 3 of implementing it.
But does that affect the success of the project as far as the actual usability? Like, do you have ever projects that fail simply because people don't end up using it because does that happen?
I don't think so if you go into it with the right ideals in place. If you go into it saying, well, just pretend this doesn't exist because we're going to change it all in the future for you, that sets the expectation that they don't have to actually adhere to the standards that are within the system. If you go into it saying our long-term plan is to tailor this to really fit the use case that you guys want, and then they get a comfortability with the way things kind of work, then you're going to have far more success, because then you're kind of expanding on an existing knowledge base, as opposed to saying, don't bother learning this because in 6 months it's just going to go away anyway, and then you don't have buy-in.
And that change management piece, I think, is one of the biggest parts. I mean, that's what we've been sort of dancing around. I think the whole presentation is that you've got to have the stakeholders in the room and ready to use the system, and so maybe a front-end discussion is a way to get buy-in. But I think that's the wrong way to go about getting buy-in. You need to have buy-in on the concept as a whole and what it does, and then the other pieces will fall into place.
The other answer that I'll put out there is, one of the points of a media asset management system is that it can abstract away a lot of that background complexity. It's not that the complexity is ever going away. In fact, it may get even more complex behind the scenes, but you're abstracting it away. And I mean, you're abstracting it away and turning what can be, potentially very complicated workflows into essentially one of several things. You could be kicking it off by altering a metadata state. You could be kicking it off by either pulling something into or dropping it into a watch folder if you kind of have a hybridized, file system and database-driven MAM system. Or maybe you have an action menu that you click on to kick off a workflow. And again, it's either being fueled by metadata tags or it's giving you a little bit of a dialogue to tweak that workflow. But I mean, these are not really difficult paradigms for people to wrap their heads around. Again, check a checkbox, pull something from a pop-up menu, click on an action menu and kick it off. And so I think it's important to have a front-end experience people can begin to get used to using for even, again, some fairly basic search use cases, maybe as the front end to an archive system, but that's just the bulk of it initially, and get them comfortable with the paradigm of that user interface, going into the MAM and learning to search through the MAM instead of delving through the file system, getting comfortable with that, making sure that your metadata is right, and then focus more and more on the background complicated stuff from a development and integration standpoint. Because when it's time to teach the users about that new, cool, automated thing that they can do, it's just going to be a metadata checkbox, something that they pull from a pull-down menu or whatever. It's not going to be that difficult to teach them how to use that new functionality if it's done correctly. Like, that's the reason we try to even mess with these systems, right? It's to make those workflows easier on people. So I think getting them used to that place that they're going to start to live more and more, and then be gradually adding up more interesting background type stuff that they can be triggering in these very easy ways is probably the right way of going about it for a lot of organizations. I mean, again, some people use these platforms and are barely using the front end. A lot of the MAMs have a lot of automation tasks and stuff that they can handle in the background, and you don't even need to interact with the front end. But for an organization that's going to be using the front end as part of their new tool set, I'd say, yeah, get it up and running fairly simplistically. You don't necessarily still just choose a MAM for its front end. You have to know what its back end capabilities are and whether those are going to meet those eventual challenges. But get the people into it fairly quickly, and again, get those easy, quick wins that get them comfortable in it, and then give them new menu options once in a while. Give them new process-oriented metadata that kicks off more and more. So more and more of their time and their day and their set of tasks are from that standardized user interface. I think we've got time for another question, and I'll do Chris.
How do you deal with project-based workflows where the files have been abstracted and you may need to recover those files 20 years from now? So you've gotten rid of the folder structure, you've backed it up onto tape, and all those files have been abstracted. How would you deal with that?
So, I mean, the most common way I've seen that done is a qualitative metadata field that stores project information. Any one of these systems, if you really want to get into the fancy stuff, you can start writing XF metadata into the files themselves. But if it's on tape somewhere, it's abstracted, and I mean, there's it's a pretty complicated, it's a lot more difficult to accomplish when you are thinking about it in the sense of that file is being completely disassociated with the thing that's creating all the logical links to it. Because my expectation would be, and maybe I'm crazy here, is that if my guys go out of business or you're jumping from one ship to the other ship, you're going to have some sort of logical transfusion of information from one to the next. So the idea that I'm going to go away doesn't scare me at all. What would scare me is that I go away and there's nothing to replace me. Maybe in 10 years, the file systems themselves actually can handle all of that metadata as a transport piece back in and through, and we aren't necessary anymore.
Chris, I'll give you a specific example that we've had to deal with a number of times now. We had this wonderful little product from a company called Apple called Final Cut Server that a lot of our clients put in with various levels of complexity. Some of them bought it because it was $1,000 and didn't quite realize what they were getting into. And some of our clients used it for extraordinarily complex workflows. We have a client in Baltimore that we are kind of in wrapping up stages of. I'm not going to name them by name, but they're a They're a for-profit education, higher learning institution, very big name, big company. And they had a very sophisticated Final Cut server system. And I believe it may have been tied into archive, but it also just triggered a lot of complex automated workflows. It was building playlists for online platforms and distribution of content to their student base and all of that. And that was dead. There was no support for it at all. I mean, heck, how many people at Apple who were even associated with Final Cut Server who are, still in even vaguely analogous roles, like one or two, but most of the others, it's one. It's Luke, right? I mean, it's like we all know who it is, right?
Exactly.
The fact that you can name him.
Yeah.
So that was the reality. But we had a few things going for us. It was an open database. We could get at the data. Anything that was put into their Final Cut server was available for us. So that really helped. We could migrate the database to whatever new platform it was going to be. In their case, it's Reach Engine. So we had access to the raw database. Number two, and it's not always the right way to do it, but in their case, a lot of their automations were external to the MAM platform. They were scripts and workflows that they, with us, developed themselves that were simply kicked off by the MAM. And we had to kind of take a full accounting of those. We documented the heck out of it with them and figured out, okay, we're not really changing these workflows. We just need a new thing to kick them. And we need to do it the way that Reach Engine wants to latch onto and kick those workflows. And we did that. And so we started to essentially kind of, it's like the X-Men Wolverine, new skeletal structure overlaying like the other one. But you really have to like rebuild the guts of it from the inside until the point you're ready to kick it over. And now all that's left is that new scaffolding that you built up kind of in tandem with the other one, right? And so it's ended up going quite successfully. These things with the development side, and I think, John, you've been involved with these guys, can take a little longer sometimes than the people initially think. But at the end of the day, we've stood up a new MAM with those same automations. Now, going just a little more specifically to your archive question, and I'm not going to take it from the end of the archive software side. I'll just take it from the side of the MAM. Let's pretend the archive software still exists, or you're using something a little more open like LTFS or just generic TARs, right? You're going to have the database, again, that's basically linked to that other archive database through metadata fields, right? And through, again, ideally, you were extracting some stuff out of the archive database as well, like the unique identifier for that object as it exists in the archive database, but you've pulled some of that data into that record in the MAM as well. And so part of your data set in the MAM database is the information that will link that record back to what's existing in the archive.
I totally get how you could do it. I'm just wondering if there are ways that we could make it easier on ourselves. So you talk about LTFS. So that it gives you the ability to mount an individual tape on your desktop, drag the media off. But if it's totally abstracted, again, all the files are abstracted. You've got no file structure that you can look at. So do we throw out the baby with the bath water, or do we preserve some of the old in order to make it so that you can totally migrate?
Well, I think I can answer that one with another use case scenario. We just did a big get a Final Cut server migration, right? There's tons of these things out there. Final Cut server wanted to manage data in a very specific way. It had a file system behind it, and you put things into things called devices, and then those devices could move things between other devices and so on and so forth. We migrated all that content in. We basically mapped all the devices as items in our world, and then we just set up rules to redistribute it all. And no user interaction had to happen whatsoever there. Basically, you kind of click the button, everything came in, and then based on those rules, everything got redistributed. And then we kind of removed the unnecessary devices and removed the unnecessary folders. And now we're in a new schema in the back end. Everything is still referenceable in the exact same way with the same keywords, metadata structure, everything like that. And, most of these MAM systems, not all of them, but most of them have a way to get out of their world and not just into their world.
Well, and I think that what you're touching on there, Mike, and it's perhaps a separate and larger discussion, is that anytime you're going into a catalog system or an archiving system or a MAM, you have to look at an exit strategy, right? Because technology does change. Companies come and go. It will. That's yes. So what if you have content like content that you might be responsible for that's going to have value in 20 years or 30 years, maybe even more value than it does now because somebody on that became a big star later on, you've got to have a strategy for that. And that's a discussion that is certainly worth having and a serious one, but it's tricky.
And actually, I'm going to just plug AVPS again. Again, there are firms that are very oriented not only about bringing your archives into the digital realm, but the right way of managing, even physical copies of the assets, but also the digital representations of them. What are, the right formats to keep things in that have longevity or multiple versions, because you can't be sure of what the future is. And again, I think the short answer is, cover your bases from as many directions as you can, because, as you said, you can kind of count on vendors changing, technologies changing, approaches changing, and have an exit strategy is not a bad idea, even to go into a discussion with a new vendor with. I think what I'm going to try to do, we could probably go on for weeks because that's, again, just what we do. But I'd like to transition this over now. There's going to be a quick set change because I want to go into the presentations. Okay. We're going to kind of go a little deeper under the hood, both with Cantamo and Reach Engine to show some of the deeper level customization and integration possibilities. So stick with us just for a few as we handle this. Thank you, everybody.